Welcome to Speaking Freely. Tonight's question is, what's Canada's place in the world? As in, what can Canadians contribute over and above just being an ally of greater powers? It's a seemingly simple question that most of us probably feel we don't know the answer to. We certainly know that as a country, we don't command the same influence and power as an economic giant like the US and China. But I think we want to believe that the positive image we have of Canada as a progressive country promoting the democratic values of inclusion, respect for individual rights and diversity, will still hold some sort of sway in the world at large. But when it comes down to it, most of us can't help but view Canada's future through the lens of how America views itself, or equally through our own hopes and fears. Fears that there will be another major economic downturn. These certainly loom large in the Canadian psyche. Inflation, there's another bogeyman that affects how much we think we can afford and spend at the moment. And for parents, I think there's the ever-present fear that the school closures of the last 2 years have robbed their kids of something, be it a healthy degree of socialization, or even more troubling and worrying, the concern that their children's generation has lost ground academically and will have trouble competing in the job market of the future. Right now in 2023, all these fears are to some extent valid. Irvin Student, our guest on today's show, himself was one of the few brave voices during the pandemic that was sounding alarm bells about the way in which public policies were harming the social and economic fabric of this country. And he was one of the very few public figures at the time to be vehemently opposed to elementary school lockdowns that became, in some provinces like Ontario, a crutch upon which to paper over the failure of our healthcare system to absorb the seasonal waves of respiratory illness that befall a country like Canada every winter season. The post-pandemic world does indeed seem to have reshuffled the card deck in a myriad of ways that are hard for most of us to make sense of. All of this leads us to wonder, what is Canada's place in the world? Are we ready to assume a leadership role? What will it take for Canada and Canadians to be able to have the confidence that the country is on the right track? That in the end, we'll be okay? Well, my guest today, Irvin Student, has thought long and hard about all these questions and many more important ones. And you'll be relieved to know that he has some answers for us. Turns out we will be okay, or rather we can be okay, if we as a country confront these pressing challenges head on in the way that he identifies in his most recent book, Canada Must Think for Itself. Post-pandemic, the world is indeed a different place in many important ways. And Student will share why this is the case and what we all need to do to prepare. So join us after the break for a stimulating discussion.
I think they should continue doing what they're doing. We only could go so far, though. There's only so much we could give. Once in a while, you have to put your foot down. And if you don't put your foot down, then they're going to continue doing what they're doing because there's no consequences. That's my opinion. Always step up to the bully and face it and punish it.
I do think Canada should be able to do more with China. As far as stopping the trade or cutting back on the trade, we're already in crisis. So I'm not really sure what the answer to this one would be. I think it's a tough one for the politicians and even tougher for the general public.
As much as we can, if we support the human rights in China in a way the people there, they can live in a good standard, in a human being standard, that would be great.
Short answer, if Canada doesn't, who will? Canada is it's a trusted name, and if we don't stand up for the right thing to do, then who else is going to do it? It doesn't look like the US is going to do that anymore. The US is just does not have the clout, does not have the US has no standing to lecture anybody else on human rights anymore. The US engaged in torture during the US engaged in torture during the Iraq War, and their democracy is backsliding. It barely counts as a democracy anymore. So if Canada doesn't do it, who will? There are other countries, of course, that can also take a strong position on human rights and hopefully will, such as Norway, for example. They've got a good reputation in that regard. But Canada should definitely be at the forefront of that.
So I think clearly that's important, human rights. China for sure, and also what's going on in Iran it's a huge, huge issue. And we have to support the Iranians because right now they're looking for a revolution and they need a lot of help. Promoting human rights is very important, of course, but we have to support our own human rights as well here especially. And we can't forget about that. That's crucial and important to our liberties.
Welcome back to Speaking Freely. Today we're joined by Irvin Studin, someone who's devoted his adult life to educating Canadians about the potential that Canada has, but also some of its failings that oftentimes are overlooked. Irvin is editor-in-chief and founder of Global Brief magazine and is the president of the Institute for 21st Century Questions. He's also recently embarked on a project that aiming to help discover or find the students that were lost during the pandemic. That is, school closures, disruptions, put a great number of kids around the world in a kind of black box that we haven't really opened or found. Irvin, thank you for joining us today.
It's a pleasure to be here. Thank you, Rafael.
Yeah, and maybe tell us a little bit about that last point that I just made. We'll get to these other areas that you've talked a lot about, Canada's place in the world, just a little later, but that new role really speaks to what preoccupied you over the last 2 years. Maybe you can tell the audience about that story.
Well, first of all, thanks for your great interest over the course of the pandemic and my own work. The tragedy in education is probably the biggest catastrophe of the pandemic period. People don't realize that as soon as you close schools, you disintegrate childhoods. So we imagine that there would be physical school, virtual school, call these two buckets. What we didn't realize is that there's a third bucket that is very large and growing as soon as you close the schools. In our own country, it was 200,000 large at the nadir of the pandemic and 500 million large, and these are kids who are in no school at all. We call them third bucket kids. They go into the street, they go into the basements, but they leave education very early, and it's a very dark place because then they integrate into a world that is much more fastidious and more difficult. Mm-hmm. And so the lesson is never close the schools, because as soon as you do it, kids leave education, mm-hmm. and that certainly wasn't the result. We're not protecting them at all. Yeah. So the Commission seeks to identify the problem, make sure we never repeat it, and then bring these kids back to education.
Right. So an international commission, and you're the chair of it.
I'm the chair. It's across 60 countries. Right. It starts here in Canada because paradoxically we had the most stable system, not the greatest system, but the most stable system. We collapsed it, and this is a very third world type of Dickensian condition that emanates, that is very difficult for us to understand, and then certainly even more difficult to accept. Right. How could we send kids to such a dark place so quickly? Yeah. We're trying to do good. Right. And so to go to that dark place is important in order to solve the problem.
Yeah, and I think that's a good place to start our discussion. The school closures were for you a sign of a more general, perhaps manic response to the pandemic. Can you maybe just walk us through some of the things that you pointed out as being, in retrospect, in fact, you were pointing out in real time, but now in retrospect we realize was ill thought out and perhaps ill conceived?
Yeah, I think the pandemic response in Canada, and I can only speak for Canada because many countries got it wrong, but many countries got it right, and certainly more right than Canada. In our case, it was, I think, one of the darkest periods in modern Canadian history. And most of it was an invention of darkness. The pandemic was objectively real. It merited a response. And I can forgive the first 3 months of overreaction and mistakes. Thereafter, we locked into a mania that grew, and serial policy mistakes of policy, mistakes of administration. and mistakes of being unable or unwilling to correct mistakes, which was unheard of in Canada. You see a mistake and you either deny it or you double down against that mistake. So there were several dimensions of that policy posture that were erroneous. First of all, episodic thinking rather than systemic thinking, systems thinking. Episodic, we imagine that everything is about public health and everything is about perhaps the hospital system and COVID rates and infection rates. And that was our reduction of all complex reality to that one barometer. And we persisted in that, and we reduced all society to dust as a result, having reduced complexity to one barometer. We doubled down on double down, we never released. Whereas quickly I realized that that's an erroneous approach. The real approach is to say there's a public health basket, there's an education basket, there's an economy basket, there's an international basket, national unity, all these things. There's a social basket and a public health, of course. And all of these things need to be balanced with greater accent, of course, on public health at certain points, and then recul, greater accent on the economy at other points. But all of these things are balls in the air. The moment we imagine that the complexity of a huge country like Canada reduces to one ball, the other balls drop. And that's what's happened. So that's the first point. Second point is that it was low energy. The government said we should quarantine. The government went to quarantine itself. And betwixt the two was disintegration. We still haven't accepted it as disintegration, but the low energy meant that no one was compensating for the demobilization of society. And the last thing is details. It was lazy, abstract Twitter feed rather than saying everything needs to be choreographed because you've destroyed this and demobilized the society. It has all these intricacies. You better be there to restitch things together in great detail.
Right. We had these sort of vacancies and these gaps in places like nursing homes, with no thought of putting more resources in, rather less. We didn't allow family members, even one family member, to access a loved one. Again, in retrospect, everyone sees this as a mistake now, but at the time you were pointing that out, which is very brave. I want to come back to something you've written about as an explanation for that. And that was that many parts of our elites in society took their own situation as given and applied it to everyone. You want to speak to that?
That's a very human condition to say that I'm okay, therefore everyone else must be okay. If I quarantine and I've taken the vaccine and I've observed all public health regulations, I'm doing my part, why can't you do your part? Just be like me. It's a very human reaction. And for the regular citizen, I wouldn't expect anything else. But when not just elites, the decision makers who are elected to positions or have professional competence for those positions delude themselves into imagining that their own virtue is replicated in the virtue of others, or their own situation is generalizable, then we have disintegration. So what happened is, as I mentioned, in the quarantine period starting in March of 2020, the government said, demobilize education, demobilize citizens, demobilize business, and they themselves went into Zoom mode. And they imagined that everyone in the world was living in their own conditions, as they were in their kitchens, with, by the way, and this is an important point, direct taxpayer-funded deposits into their bank accounts. So they were comfortable. They were not fending for their existence. 9 to 5, you retire comfortably, your family, you watch Netflix, you have a long weekend, and then you go and you issue decrees again from Monday morning at 9 a.m. and you repeat. And you don't realize that in the interstitial area, that is after 5 p.m. on the weekends, other parts of the society are dying or fending for their lives because you haven't thought it through into detail, and you haven't provided the compensatory energy. You haven't provided in financial terms, you haven't provided in human terms, you haven't gone door to door and say, are you guys okay? Is everyone being educated? All business is okay. And then you're surprised when you wake up and say, there's all this disintegration, right? And it's too big to behold. And the reaction so far is that we go back to that narcissistic shell.
And I think you just explained the shock of the elites to something like the truckers' protest. They were caught completely off guard. Whereas if you were talking to people who had jobs like a truck driver or a small business or an enterprise that could not close and just work from Zoom, you would have seen the building of frustration, of desperation and fear. And when elites are disconnected from that ground level reality, those are the things that can happen. And that's what you're speaking to when you say disintegration, just for the audiences.
100%. So to put it clearly, in my view, an existential écart between the elites and the regular population was that they were getting direct deposits in their bank accounts for which they did not need to sell or fight. And they were closing off businesses that needed to sell and fight for their very existence. And they imagined that they should just replicate their own situation, which for the businesses would result in death, right? Literally death. So when the truckers and everyone who understood it showed up in Ottawa, in my view, Ottawa regarded them as barbarians or Philistines. Who are these people?
Barbarians at the gate. Literally.
Barbarians at the gate, but they didn't understand. And to this day, they don't understand who these people are. Why did they come? And that's because Ottawa deluded itself, as did, by the way, Queen's Park and other capitals in Canada, into imagining that everyone was living in their own condition and that they held a monopoly on virtue and wisdom. And they didn't realize what was happening in the country. How could they realize what was happening in the second largest country in the world from Zoom rooms in their kitchen over the course of 2 years, regardless of intellect? The Chinese always say the emperor is very far, which means the emperor doesn't know what happens on the outskirts of the Chinese empire. And Canada's bigger than the Chinese empire, right? Canada's as big as the Ottoman, Persian, and Roman empires combined geographically. So I know for a fact that the good people in Ottawa have no idea what's happening in the country. To this day, they don't understand the circumstances of the country.
And maybe just bringing it back then. So that's an episode that under your analysis was almost wholly predictable, that it would have culminated into some event of some bursting. But the second point, and bring you back to the education, which is the future, which, as you said, our own country, we were unaware of the different ways in which jurisdictions had tackled the pandemic. Credit to some provinces. BC kept schools open from June 2020. And in Ontario, we closed 4 times. I think it gets to your point. Canada's big. How did we not learn even from each other during the pandemic? How is that possible that one jurisdiction keeps schools open from June 2020? An NDP government, no less. And in a conservative government, we closed them 4 times, had the longest school closures of almost any jurisdiction.
Well, I think on social media and maybe in the Canadian public at large, we overestimate the idea of intelligent conspiracy. Ours was not not that. There was no calculation or intelligence involved. Ours was serial degeneracy, policy mistake after policy mistake that, taken at scale, becomes what I call a policy crime. So you repeat it and enough people suffer or die, God forbid, then it's a crime, even though you're in public, you're in a position of public authority. And unfortunately, we had different degrees of that policy degeneracy, but much less wise in the end than other countries that saw the proportion of the pandemic. And thank God it wasn't as big as many historical pandemics, certainly not as big as the Black Death or anything in between. That's why I say after the first 3 months, we should have seized the scale of the pandemic and been much more targeted. But we generalized the gear and we disintegrated the society, thinking that we were in the Russian-Ukrainian war or something, God forbid. And the result is catastrophic. Other societies worked harder to maintain the rhythm, to resuscitate the rhythm, and they provided that energy, what I call the extroversion of government reaching out. And don't go door to door to see whether someone is following social distancing or vaccination. Go door to door to find out what's happened in that intervening period when you force them out of business or education. Are you okay? And provide the compensatory energy to bring them back. And that's foreign to our thinking in Canada.
Which countries would you say did that, the former?
There are different countries that had different parts. So on education, the countries that were more systems-based, here I'm talking about most of the East Asian, Southeast Asian countries, some in Europe.
Like Sweden.
Sweden was in a different category, but those were systems thinking. They understood that if you close the system in the physical space, there would be leakage in other words. So they didn't close it for very long, or they provided compensatory energy. So they had very few of these third bucket kids. Other countries had very robust compulsory education, for instance, Germany, Netherlands, Sweden, Finland. So we have compulsory education. It was on the books, and you could drive a truck through it as soon as there was pressure. So we had all this leakage into the third bucket, which is no school at all, and they had none. So they look at us, Austria, for instance, on the commission, they look at us like we're from Mars. What do you mean you have tens of thousands of kids not in school permanently ad infinitum? I said, yeah. but we're both third world. For first world, how did you do that? Well, we had real compulsory schooling. You cannot leave school.
Right.
And there was another category which I find interesting, where Canada must be humble and now learn, is countries that were just relaxed.
Right.
They said they measured the proportion of the crisis, and they said, this ain't that much, right? Let's relax. You're talking about several Latin American countries, Mexico on the democratic side, Nicaragua on the authoritarian side. But strangely enough, before the Russo-Ukrainian war, Belarus, Russia, and Ukraine were much more relaxed. Probably because they knew what a real crisis could take. But it's a lesson for us to say, and by the way, many African countries more relaxed.
Yeah.
They didn't destroy, first of all, they said, this ain't much historically, and secondly, we need to survive, so we can't close the society.
Right.
You never close the society.
Right.
You keep it going because it dies like an organism.
Right. Yeah, it's sort of we re-inverted the be calm, carry on motto from the World War II. We inverted it to sort of lose our heads and let's panic, right? Anyway, I appreciate these excellent observations about the last 2 years. But after the break, we're going to shift to the bigger picture, which all of this fits in, by the way. Yeah. Why Canada must think for itself, and your views on where Canada can go in the future.
Thanks very much.
Join us right after the break. Welcome back to Speaking Freely. We're talking with Irvin Student. And just before the break, we made mention of a phrase that said, Canada must think for itself. Well, that's a great phrase, but it's also the title of Irvin's latest book. And just before the break, we made mention of how Canada didn't even learn from itself during the pandemic. We had jurisdictions, as we mentioned, BC, but even Quebec, which managed to keep most of society open, especially the schools, and Ontario didn't, which was the largest jurisdiction. So Canada's geography plays a big role in your latest thesis, in your latest book. Do you want to walk us through that idea of Canada as not having one border, but actually four?
Yeah. Well, first of all, thanks for your interest in the book. It's a long time coming, and I think the timing is good. But the title says "Think for Itself." There are two key parts. One is thinking, and we presume that because we're educated, we're in an advanced society, everyone's thinking. And I said, no. Real thinking requires resources and time and problems and experience. And then for itself is the scariest part, because we're thinking, but we don't realize that a lot of our thinking is zombie thinking or mimicked by powers or outside forces that are not our own and not operating in our interests. And this at a time when Canada is really on its knees. And so we have to muster that energy to think, and then to do it for ourselves is scary for Canada. The borders are what I call ACRE or ACRE, America, China, Russia, Europe. And if everyone imagines Canada as a square or a rectangle, America is the border about which we obsess, it's the A, but we're also surrounded by four other major powers. China to the west, that's the C. Europe to the east, that's the E. And the R in between is Russia across the Arctic. And if really one looks around, those are our effective borders. And if we don't master them, they can either disintegrate us or crush us in 15 combinations, I calculate. And so we better get our act together. That will force us either to do one of two things: to really collapse into a deep vassal state, protected by the Americans, where the Americans do all our thinking. The Americans will say, should be our position, this should be the product we sell, this is the way of thinking. And we say, aye, aye, sir, even if it's unconscious. And that's where we are now. Or, in my view, the more attractive picture, we become a major power in our own right, not for being power, but to survive and to have dignity and to fend for ourselves and to advance our own interests as a major power amongst these configurations. That's the only way to survive, either as a deep vassal state or a major power in our own right. So ACRE is a framework I'm commending to decision makers. And we're not yet there because we're so in the American gravity.
And you had a great example, both in the book, but also in your discussions around it, of like the Huawei episode in Canada. You know, if you recall, we took an American request to arrest a high-level high-level Huawei executive, who happened to be the daughter of the founder of the very company, with very close ties to the Chinese administration. And we were caught in between for the first time. We thought we were being protected by America. It turns out we weren't. And China, we had no way of relating to them. So that's kind of an episode that, brings to light what you're saying, that if we don't think of this four-pronged version of our borders, we are going to be stuck in this vassal state, right?
Yeah.
And that's an important contribution, I think, to our thinking.
Well, thank you. The Meng Wanzhou is just what I call a paper cut of the pressures that could face us, and that huge cost, it almost brought down governments, and in several countries, right? And it applied a pressure that is far smaller than could be applied if these combinations of forces really come to play against us. So I said we must think more eclectically. We must have mastery of all those borders and all the relation in between. So we need Russia-China experts. How many are there in Canada? Not just Russia and China, but Russia-China relations. There are 0 experts. How many real China experts are there in Canada? I mean, real, 2 or 3. Russia, 0. Russia-Europe, 0. And so we don't know our own combinations. As soon as they come, they surprise us. And then we go into the vassal conditions. Washington tell us what to do, what to think. Well, thank you for asking. Here's what you should do. And of course, it's in Washington's interest. And from the outside of Canada, it looks obvious that that's a vassal condition. To us, it's a surprise and offensive. And I said, well, here's how to unwind, but it will take a lot of work and to master our circumstances.
It will take a lot of work. I'm reminded of a book that I was taught when I was at university by the professor who wrote it. It was called Baneful Domination. You might want to look at it. It's the history of Canada through 2 if you will, colonial powers. First Britain, but then America. And we've kind of always had that in the background. So it's going to be very hard for Canada, I think, to step out of that, as you said, vassal or client mentality. What are some solutions? How can we redress that? I know you've spoken about immigration as a possibility. Maybe that could be something that we could bring into the conversation. Well,
first of all, one must accept that we're in a vassal condition, regardless of education, regardless of living standards and our good history in Canada. We're an old state, but people have difficulty believing we're an old country. Accept it. We're in a vassal condition. Very well. Do we want to make it deepen the vassal condition? That is a predilection of current governments. Yeah, let's deepen. We're one. Or do we say, this is not working for us? Look, our economy is disintegrating. It's captured mostly by American interests. Our entire information base is Twitter and Facebook and LinkedIn, all American concerns. And if we get a predatory president of the United States, we're cooked because we don't have anything to resist. And yet we have all these borders that have to be mastered. Well, fortunately, one of the exits is these borders. And if you look at our geography, you look at the distribution of the population, we don't have enough people in the north to master the melting Arctic, the advent of China, and all the pressures there. That has a defensive dimension, which is say we built a fort, but I say let's be offensive, and therefore we say we need more people in total, immigrants or not, across the geography, push them up the distribution, and then we say, well, we embed China, Russia, the United States, Europe, and other countries in a framework through the north that secures the peace, but also secures trading relationships that are 7-to-1 in our favor over the American market space in terms of pure volume. That's all a Canadian construction that can really help us raise our game, in the absence of which they'll all be fighting across our territories and will destroy us before long. And that happens to a lot of countries.
Yeah, and that's kind of what's happening in the Arctic now. As that ice melts, people are fighting over the passageways for shipping traffic. And without a presence, we will just kind of concede all that space. Right?
It is true that this is happening slowly but surely in the sea space. But I think for the South here in Toronto and Montreal and Vancouver, let's imagine flights. We imagine flights that are close from Whitehorse to Beijing, or Whitehorse to St. Petersburg, or Whitehorse to Oslo. That all of a sudden says, oh, trading relationships, cultural relations, science, and also from Yellowknife to Chicago. It's all there. But all of a sudden, it's not in frozen tundra. It's just the new Toronto, the new Montreal, the new Halifax. It's in the north. And it just so happens that circumstances change the distribution of populations. Now, that means that Toronto won't be the center of the action in the next century, and so be it. Toronto isn't the center of the action in my future view of Canada. But if we want a Canada, the north becomes central, and it's an opportunity to escape our vassal condition.
Yeah, and you pointed out that the western part of Canada is closer to Beijing than Australia is. And we
right.
always think Australia is being tied to Russia, but it's farther geographically.
That's right.
So geography plays this very important role in your thinking. In terms of the energy, I want to come back to that. You mentioned how the pandemic was this low energy response to a crisis. Rather than activating people, mobilizing those that were healthy and and could have contributed to that help that was required to compensate for lockdowns and so on. Where do you draw that energy? How does it come into being? Who's responsible? Is it a bottom-up recognition that then prompts politicians and those in power, or how does that happen?
It's a historical question. So, as a first, the scientists and social science historians always ask: does the energy from a society come from within, or does the leadership come and say, or is it both? And it's probably a combination of both, but certainly leadership is a huge injector. Sustained leadership and pressure and inspiration. We have none of that. We're doing the reverse. So the energy point is not. I'm not talking about coal and
I know.
And I'm talking about human energy.
Yeah.
And what happened in the pandemic is we collapsed 7 or 8 systems. We collapsed the economy, education, the social fabric, public health, national unity, international space institutions. We brought it down to a lower x-axis, right? This is where we were in 2020. We're down here. This is where we need to be in 2023 because the world is much more cruel. We're down here. To get back to where we were in 2020 is a huge energy differential. Where's that going to come from? Well, it's going to come from one of the 2 sources we discussed, leadership or the human side. But for now, we are telling ourselves stories at this lower level x-axis that says, oh, we're good, everything's back to normal, we're Canadian. And what we are doing, à notre insu, is consolidating a lower level of living across the systems. There's no other way, right? To get back here, I propose this northern project with huge influx of demography and investment. I call for a huge special economic zone in the northwest of the country that will open up economic activity. But of course, across the leadership class, starting with the political class, the professions, the academy, there needs to be a sense that, oh my God, now it is all guns blazing because we're fighting for our lives. And other countries have it, and we're doing the latter. We're consolidating. So that's where it comes from. There are other things in the book that I discussed that can provide that.
And I just thought of something else that connects all this discussion, our first discussion around the pandemic policies and the current one. This focus on America, led us to, this very convenient Canadian response. Look how well we did. Well, we did so well compared to America, compared to a country that doesn't provide healthcare for 20 million citizens, that has huge inequalities, huge obesity. This is your standard. You didn't look to Europe, you didn't look to Sweden, you didn't look to these East Asian countries. How do we change that framework? Because I think that's crucial. If we stop looking at the A and look to the world, this could be the opening.
Of course, the change would be revolutionary, and in some sense that would be the revolution we never had. Without changing government, without changing, removing the empire or the king, to do this in political terms, without collapsing all institutions, understand, would be very difficult. But it's necessary, in my view, to survive. Now, let's first look at the information space. That's the space in which we're first vassalized. People don't realize, including the pandemic. Twitter is controlled by American algorithms. It's designed by American money and American genius. I say with complete admiration. It's their product, their achievement. We imagine that our free speech, in the second largest country in the world, is a small part of the real estate of an American algorithm. The change in leadership from the rich to the richest man in the world, all of a sudden, for some parts of the political spectrum, provides with free speech, and other parts, it's a complete absurdity. We're captured on that. As soon as that information space becomes missionary for certain political positions or language or products, not to be mentioned, we're stuck. We end up imbibing that automatically. So there's no way without having our own information space that we can devassalize. Beyond that, I talked about the USMCA, which formally vassalizes us. This is the free trade agreement that we signed without any resistance that vassalizes us in everyone's eyes except our own understanding. Right? We need to have our own economic structure, our own major companies, our own markets, and the 100 million vision is part of that human energy, because we need both the capital to build products and the consumer market in which to experiment and build. Over time, what must come is, amongst a small group of leaders, a non-vassalized mentality. That is to say, if you look at Singapore, if you look at Israel, you look at UAE, you look at even Qatar, these are small countries, whatever their internal differences, that say, you know what, we're small, we think for ourselves, and we have to think for ourselves to survive in a wicked world. The world has changed vis-a-vis Canada. We're going to have to adopt that mentality if we're going to survive, because the vassal condition might make us miserable, could make us very fortunate. But the reverse proposition means that we're maître chez nous. We control our destiny, even though it's a much more complicated and scary world in which we'll have to navigate.
Yeah, and that's a good point. We think that we can't do it because we're small. Try talking to a country of several million people in a zone of, huge superpowers. We're talking about the countries in the Middle East. You mentioned Israel, UAE, a few million people around potential neighbors that are not just American domineering, but could have military force at any point applied to you. And you're right, they've struck out. So it's possible. And Canada's not small in that sense. Yeah. And just to end off, when you mentioned the 100 million project, that's your sort of vision for kind of steady state population. Yeah. That if we have the space, we have this opportunity in the north that's growing because of climate change for 100 million people in Canada. Yeah. And this is something else that you can read about in the book, which I recommend highly. Canada Must Think for Itself. Thanks so much, Irvin, for joining us today.
A real pleasure. Thanks.
So join us after the break. We'll have some closing comments about our discussion today.
I actually don't really know a lot about this subject, but I'm going to assume that we're doing our very best. I do think that Canada should lead the way in a carbon neutral economy. The reasons why are it would help the planet, obviously, but these things take a lot of time, and I'm hopeful that Canada is on the right track.
I don't know. I come from Brazil, so I feel like we're doing more of I would say I don't know, movements for people to kind of realize what's going on. And I don't feel like here I find enough information of what's going on here in Canada. So I think Canada should lead the way to carbon neutral resources. Just to help the environment, I think that would be a big help. Yeah.
There is many ways to protect the environment than to control our production of the oil and gas. So we can produce as much as we can, because already our society suffering from the price of all the gas and oil. So we have to support our society. We have to live. And then we can control the environment with many other different ways. They produce as much as they can, but they can control the carbon ratio, or whatever you call it, in other different ways, like the power generation. If they go with all the natural resources like solar power, windmills, all this kind of thing, that would save a lot. But for the gas production and oil production, we need it, like the society need it. So I don't believe they can minimize that production.
We're not going to be in a position to completely abandon the use of oil all of a sudden. It's got to be an incremental wind down. The economics anyway favor renewables because the cost per kilowatt hour of generating electricity using wind and solar is now so low, and it's only going to get lower and lower, especially with solar, that oil is simply going to become uneconomical. However, at present anyway, there's no other means there's nothing else with the energy density, as far as I know, to power, for example, airplanes and possibly big trucks. There's certainly going to be a few uses still for oil for decades into the future, without a doubt. So we can't stop cold turkey, but what they need to focus on really, I think, is getting Canada's oil as clean as possible, reducing as far as possible the emissions required to get it out of the ground and make it usable, get that as low as possible so that it's a somewhat more responsible or less irresponsible source of oil, and prepare for a very different future in which all energy sources are clean.
I think so. Canada is doing well because we need that oil. Everybody, I guess, I don't really know too much, but everything in Canada I think is fantastic.
I would agree. From what the knowledge I have sourced about, yes, they're their proper resources, but if there is still room for improvements.
I truly believe they could do a lot more. You know, supporting our allies is huge to keep us united.
I think we should move away from oil because it's toxic to the environment and air. And in the future, it causes diseases for human beings, cancer, lung problems, and also it's pretty expensive to keep importing and exporting.
Clearly, there's always issues with the American aggression, and Canada has its stand. But I believe, you know, we should go our own route, obviously, because we do have, you know, our rights, and that we don't like to impose rights on other countries as well. So I think that, you know, to help Ukraine is very important, and to what extent, you know, that'll be up to the government.
If Mr. Trudeau is a really democratic man, he has no right to send billion and give it to Ukraine or to Russia. He has no right to do that. For me, he should leave everybody by his own choice to support Ukraine or to support Russia. Like, why he took our taxes to send it to somebody? Maybe I don't believe in the way he did it. That's my opinion. And finally, no winner will be in this war. No winner. It will end up with a diplomatic solution. So as soon as they reach this diplomatic, whatever solution they reach, as soon as they do it, is a lot better, not to avoid losses of life of young men and even young kids and women. And this is unfair. That's really unfair.
I do believe that Canada can do more to help the world in its fight for freedom. I'm not so sure I agree with the US policy. I believe that it is just adding to the war rather than trying to promote peace.
Canada's name internationally is very well trusted and depended upon. That said, Ukraine is, if there was ever a just war, I think it's the side of the Ukrainians. And Canada, I think, could be doing plenty to support them there without putting our own soldiers on the battlefield. So helping them with equipment and especially intelligence, I think would be a very good role for Canada to play.
Right now, Ukraine, they need help. So I think they should help with aid and resort like food, because the States is protecting us too. So
we should support army to help, like right now, Ukraine. I agree with that. Yeah, I cannot talk about Russia, but I talk about Putin. For me, he's out of his mind. I find he's very like a narcissist, and he's gonna do anything to win this war. He's gonna do anything. He doesn't care if if he's gonna send a bomb to destroy Europe, part of Europe. He doesn't care. I think that's my opinion.
Changes, to paraphrase a famous quote from David Bowie. Most people can't cope with the rate of change in this world. It's all far too fast. And yet, like death and taxes, change is something we cannot avoid. I'm grateful to our guest today, Irvin Student, for helping us make sense of Canada's changing place in the post-pandemic world order, and for helping us envision a future of prosperity and opportunity for our country. It's truly refreshing to speak to someone who is not only adept at diagnosing some of our country's biggest problems, but is also able to suggest some sensible and positive solutions to resolve them. And I agree with Dr. Student in his assertion that Canada is not being proactive enough in charting an autonomous economic and political path apart from its relationship with our southern neighbor, the US. We need to energize and give Canadians a common purpose, something to work towards. Developing our northern region is one idea, but there are many other common projects that we as a country could work together as. Canada needs energy, human energy, not lethargy, and it needs to realize that we live in a multipolar world in which Canada's true borders stretch to the far north with Russia, to the south with the US, to the east with Europe, and to the west with China. This ACRE model with America, China, and Europe should be front and center in Canada's thinking. And thinking for yourself is always a good recipe to live on a personal level and as a country. So thanks for sharing your time with us today. And as always, I encourage you to stay curious and compassionate.